6th June 1944, Normandy, France. Invasion of Europe. Thousands of Allied soldiers pushing through the chaos of ocean surf, sand, wire, and endless German fire. But among the waves of men fighting to gain a foothold on Omaha Beach, one young soldier carried with him something most others didn't notice. A strange technique he trained in secret. A crawl. A pistol-only crawl. His buddies joked about it. His sergeant rolled his eyes at it. But on this day, on this beach, under the worst fire imaginable, that crawl would become the difference between life and death. They laughed at him once, but what he did next would silence a German machine gun nest and save dozens of men.
At 0630 hours, the ramps of the landing craft slammed down and hell opened. MG-42 bursts ripped across the beach in long, vicious streams of fire. Mortar shells slammed into the sand, sending explosions of dirt and seawater into the air. The tide was red. The screams were everywhere. Men ran. Men fell. Men crawled just to avoid the steel cutting through the air. Omaha, especially Dog Green sector, was a killing zone. And somewhere among those first waves was Private First Class William Hayes of the 116th Infantry Regiment, 29th Infantry Division. A quiet kid from Iowa, not the toughest, not the loudest, but determined in a way nobody else quite understood.
Training back in England hadn't been easy for Hayes. He wasn't the strongest, and during rifle drills he struggled to keep up. But he had one thing he focused on: movement. As the others practiced standard prone firing, William had practiced a low, awkward crawl using only his elbows and knees, keeping his profile almost flush with the ground. The others laughed at him, telling him it looked ridiculous. "You're gonna crawl all the way to Berlin with just that pistol?" one soldier had joked. William only smiled. He never explained it. He didn't need to. In his mind, he kept repeating a simple idea. The closer you get without being seen, the longer you live. Now, on Omaha Beach, that strange, self-taught crawl became his only shield. The moment the ramp dropped and the first wave was shredded, Hayes didn't run. He dove. Face into wet sand, the bitter smell of seawater and cordite filling his nose. Machine gun fire hissed just inches above him. Men around him were hit before they even made it 10 steps. Hayes pressed himself flat and began to move the only way he knew how. Elbows digging into the sand, knees dragging him forward, pistol kept tight against his chest.
Every inch felt like a lifetime. The sand shook with each mortar impact. A shell dropped just 30 yards to his right, throwing a spray of metal shards across the beach. One shard tore across his sleeve, burning his skin, but he kept moving. Ahead of him, the German positioned atop the bluff spat out steady, terrifying bursts of MG-42 fire. Over 1,200 rounds per minute, ripping into anything that dared rise above the ground. Hayes could hear the rounds snapping over his head like angry hornets. "Get to cover! Move! Move!" officers shouted, though most of their commands vanished into the noise. Many soldiers rushed toward wooden stakes and anti-landing obstacles for cover. But Hayes already knew those weren't stopping MG fire. The only shield he had was being invisible. And for that, staying flat was everything. By 0645 hours, the beach was littered with abandoned gear, rifles, helmets, packs, dropped by men desperate to stay light and get to the shingle mine. Hayes passed bodies he recognized, young faces from training, a friend who played harmonica every night, another who talked about opening a bakery after the war. Hayes felt a hard ache in his chest, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. The machine gun nest directly ahead was pinning down dozens of survivors. If it wasn't silenced, none of them would get off the beach alive. Hayes pressed himself lower. Waves crawled up around him, soaking his uniform. Sand stuck to his face. A bullet kicked up dirt just inches from his eye. He didn't look toward it. He kept crawling. Slow, quiet, deliberate. He could see the base of the cliff now. Razor wire and jagged metal obstacles blocked the way, but he spotted an opening. Small, but enough space for one man to slip through if he stayed low enough. As he edged closer, he finally saw the MG-42 nest clearly. 2 German gunners, 3 riflemen nearby. They were firing in disciplined bursts, cutting down any attempt at forward movement. Hayes counted the rhythm of their fire. He watched when they paused to reload. He watched how the assistant gunner fed the belt. And he calculated one fragile chance. If he could get just 20 more yards without being seen, he'd be close enough for his pistol to matter. Close enough for the crawl they mocked to finally mean something. Behind him, a lieutenant tried rallying his men for a charge. It failed in seconds. Another burst sent the group diving into the sand. Hayes heard their frustration, fear, desperation. No one could move. No one could breathe. The entire advance was stuck because of one nest. Hayes exhaled slowly. This was it. The moment his strange training met the brutal reality of war, and as he pushed forward through sand, smoke, and death, little did he know what he was about to do would become the kind of stories soldiers would whisper about for years.
By 0700 hours, smoke from burning landing craft drifted low across the waterline, mixing with the morning fog and giving the beach a ghostly haze. Hayes used it like a friend. He slid forward, barely lifting his elbows, careful not to create any sudden movement that the Germans could detect. At this range, even a twitch could draw fire. The sound of the MG-42 was constant. Short bursts, long bursts, the rising metallic whine as the barrel overheated, the momentary silence as they swapped it. Hayes listened to everything. Every pause was a window. Every reload was a chance.
He could feel his heartbeat hammering in his ears. Sweat mixed with seawater dripped into his eyes, but he didn't dare wipe it. He kept moving, always forward. A piece of shrapnel hissed past him and tore into the sand ahead. He flinched but didn't stop. The air around him smelled of smoke, salt, and burning fuel, an odor that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The cries of medics echoed somewhere behind him, but they were distant now, muffled by the roar of battle and the thundering surf. Hayes had tunneled into his own world, a narrow path between life and death that existed only inches above the sand.
10 more yards. That was all he needed. 10 yards and he'd be within pistol range. Exceptionally close given the chaos, but that had been his plan all along. He wasn't a marksman. He wasn't trying to win a shooting contest. He just needed to get close enough where accuracy didn't matter, where surprise and desperation would do the rest. Behind him, a sergeant he recognized shouted for a squad to prepare smoke grenades. Hayes heard the metallic clank of one landing somewhere to his left. White smoke bloomed upward, thickening the haze. The Germans fired into it blindly, sweeping their machine gun barrel across the area. Bullets tore through the smoke like angry streaks, cutting into obstacles and kicking up sand. Hayes froze as the line of fire passed inches in front of him. He could feel the vibration of rounds hitting wood and metal. One more sweep and he might not survive. But the smoke forced the MG crew to adjust. They shifted their attention left, toward the larger movement. Hayes saw his chance. He pushed forward again, 3 feet, 5 feet, then another yard. He was so close now that he could hear the German gunner shouting commands. He could hear the metallic rattle of the ammo belt being fed into the chamber. He could even hear the scrape of the gun being repositioned.
8 yards. 7. 6. This was closer than anyone on the beach dared to go, not because they didn't want to, but because surviving this long under direct fire was nearly impossible. The razor wire ahead looked like a wall of metal, twisted into cruel knots. But Hayes spotted a depression where the wire sagged, a gap barely as wide as his helmet. He angled his body, pressed himself flat, and slid beneath it.
The wire grazed his pack, nearly snagging it, but he eased forward until he was through. On the other side, the sand rose into a small natural ridge, just a foot high, but enough to give him a moment to breathe. He pressed against it, listening to the rhythm of gunfire above him. The MG-42 continued tearing into the beach. Hayes peeked just enough to see the barrel. Smoke curled from it. The assistant gunner was shouting something, probably about overheating. Hayes knew machine gun barrels couldn't fire endlessly. They needed swapping. That moment would be the weakness, the crack in the armor.
He braced himself. His pistol, a standard M1911, felt small in his hand. Light. Almost too light compared to the roar of the MG-42 ahead. But it was reliable. And at this distance, it was all he needed. He checked the magazine with a quick practice movement. Full. He tightened his grip. Just then, he heard a voice behind him, someone yelling for him to come back, to wait for backup. But backup wasn't getting through. Dozens of men were still pinned down. Another landing craft was trying to unload, and the MG-42 shredded the surf around it. Hayes looked back at the beach. The chaos, the fear, the helplessness. Then he looked forward. One nest. That was the obstacle. One nest was holding down an entire sector. He exhaled slowly. The moment had come. And little did he know, what he was about to do would change the fate of that stretch of beach. Hayes pushed up from the ridge just enough to get a clearer line. The gunners were mid-reload. The assistant was feeding a new belt. The gunner wasn't expecting anyone this close. No one should have been this close. Hayes steadied his breathing. The world narrowed to a single target. He rose just enough to bring the pistol up. In the noise of the beach, a single gunshot felt insignificant, almost swallowed by the sound of explosions. But it hit. Clean. The German gunner jerked backward, surprise frozen on his face. The assistant gunner stumbled, reaching for the weapon. Hayes fired again, and again, quick, controlled shots. The assistant fell. The three riflemen turned, confused, scrambling for position. Hayes dropped back behind the ridge as bullets cracked above him. Sand kicked up into his eyes. The Germans fired wildly, trying to hit a target they couldn't see. He moved left, just a few feet, enough to force them to guess wrong about his position. He rose again, fired twice, then dropped. A German rifle round slammed into the ridge where his head had been a second earlier. Hayes rolled, pushed himself into another shallow depression. He was in their blind spot now. Closer. He needed to get closer. The nest was partially built into the earth, reinforced with timber and sandbags. He could hear one of the riflemen shouting that the gun was down. Another was calling for a replacement gunner. Hayes didn't give them the chance. He crawled to the base of the structure, heart pounding. He could hear footsteps just on the other side. He held his breath. A shadow moved. Hayes lunged upward and fired from less than 5 feet away. The rifleman collapsed, dropping his Mauser. Another German tried to swing his weapon around, but Hayes shot first. The cramped nest erupted into chaos, shouts echoing in German. Hayes ducked behind a sandbag wall as a bullet tore into the wood beside him. He felt splinters cut across his cheek, but didn't hesitate. He spun out, fired twice, and silence followed. For a moment, Hayes just stood there, breathing hard, unable to fully process what he'd done. The nest that had pinned down an entire American assault sector was quiet. Smoke drifted from the MG-42 barrel, now unmanned and useless. The sound of battle continued across the beach, but here, just for a moment, there was a strange stillness. Then he heard shouting from below. American voices, men pointing up at him, hope rising. The path forward was open.
The wind shifted, carrying the distant rumble of artillery from further inland. Hayes wiped the splinters and sand from his cheek, his breath still uneven. Down on the beach, the pinned-down Americans were rising from behind obstacles, disbelief turning into momentum. A few pointed upward at him, shouting for others to notice what had just happened. The terrifying roar of the MG-42, a sound that had dominated the battlefield for nearly an hour, was gone. For the first time since landing, the men of the 116th Infantry saw an opening.
Hayes didn't wait for recognition. He knew something crucial. Silencing one nest didn't mean the hill was safe. German defenses were layered. Behind this first position, more firing points were dug into the bluff. If the Americans charged now, they'd still be cut down unless someone cleared the path. Hayes turned from the machine gun and scanned the slope above. He could see another position, higher, partially hidden by scrub brush, firing intermittently toward the waterline. That one wasn't as dominant as the first, but it was enough to stall the next phase of the advance. He crouched low and moved along the inner edge of the nest, keeping his body hidden from the higher gun. His boots sank into loose earth as he climbed, each step deliberate. He passed the abandoned MG-42, still warm from constant firing. For a moment he considered picking it up, but he knew operating it alone, without a second gunner, was unrealistic in this terrain. The pistol was lighter, quieter, and kept him mobile. Mobility, he felt, was the only reason he'd survived this far.
Down on the sand, an officer blew a whistle and began directing men toward the bluff. Hayes heard their footsteps splashing through shallow surf, boots sinking into wet sand as they moved toward the shingle line. Their voices grew louder. The tide was turning, slowly, painfully, but turning. Hayes focused on the slope ahead. The ground here was uneven, dotted with craters from naval gunfire. Smoke drifted through the torn vegetation. Above him, the second German position fired sporadically toward the beach. It wasn't as relentless as the nest he had just cleared, but it was still blocking the advance. Hayes edged along a narrow gully carved into the hillside. The earth here was dark and damp, smelling of churned soil and smoke. Twisted roots formed natural handholds as he pulled himself upward. Each step brought him closer to the second firing point, close enough now that he could hear the muffled exchange of orders in German. He paused, listening carefully. 2 soldiers, maybe 3. A light machine gun, likely an MG-34. Its firing pattern was slower, more controlled, but in the chaos below it was enough to keep the Americans pinned. Hayes checked his pistol again. 5 rounds left. His magazine pouch had 1 full reload. That was it. No grenades, no rifle, just the pistol and the crawl that had brought him this far. He steadied his breathing. His body ached from the crawl, his elbows raw from the sand, but adrenaline pressed him forward. He pressed himself against the earth and crawled the last 5 yards, emerging behind a cluster of low bushes. Through the branches, he could see the German position clearly now. A makeshift dugout, reinforced with wooden planks, half camouflaged with branches.
1 German gunner knelt behind the MG-34, firing down toward the beach. Another soldier stood beside him, scanning with binoculars. A third man sat further back, loading ammunition belts. Hayes waited for the right moment. Timing, once again, would decide everything. The gunner paused to steady the weapon. The observer shifted his stance, leaning forward. Hayes moved. He rose from the bushes and stepped forward, steady and controlled. The observer heard the movement and turned, eyes widening. Too late. Hayes fired once, then twice. The observer fell backward. The gunner lunged for his sidearm, but Hayes fired again, dropping him before he could react. The ammunition loader scrambled, reaching for a rifle, but his hands shook. Hayes advanced quickly, staying low, and the man froze as the pistol came within inches of him. A final shot ended the threat. For a moment, Hayes stood still, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. The position was quiet. Below him, the beach erupted in a new wave of movement as American soldiers charged forward, no longer held back by overlapping fields of German fire. They reached the shingle line, then the seawall, then the base of the bluff. Officers shouted for climbing teams to advance. Engineers with Bangalore torpedoes approached the wire obstacles. The entire sector seemed to surge at once.
Hayes crouched inside the German dugout, reloading his pistol with shaking hands. His fingers trembled, not from fear, but from the sheer exhaustion of the last hour. The morning had felt like days. He wiped the sweat from his brow, smearing dirt across his forehead. Outside, American voices grew louder as more men reached the slope. He considered staying hidden and letting the main force pass, but then he heard something. Footsteps above him, moving fast. Germans. A small squad, likely responding to the gunfire from both lost positions. Hayes pressed himself against the inner wall of the dugout, listening carefully. The footsteps drew closer. He counted at least 4 men, maybe 5. They spoke quietly, urgently, moving toward the path he had climbed. Hayes knew if they reoccupied this position, or worse, if they retook the first machine gun nest, they'd trap the Americans on the slope again, undoing everything gained in the last minutes. He couldn't allow that. He peeked out from the dugout, spotting a narrow flank route along the ridge. He followed it, keeping low, until he reached a vantage point. The German squad was moving in a staggered line, rifles ready, focused downward toward the beach. They hadn't seen him. He crouched behind a fallen tree trunk, heart pounding again. This time, he didn't have the element of distance. This time, they were within yards. The closest German stopped to signal his squad. Hayes took a breath. He stepped out.
The Germans turned, surprised, hands going for weapons. Hayes fired. Twice. A third time. The closest soldier fell. Another staggered. One shouted in shock. Hayes dropped behind the tree, feeling bullets chip bark above him. He rolled to the right, found another angle, and returned fire. His shots were quick, instinctive. Years later, he wouldn't remember how many he fired, only that each one mattered. The brief firefight ended as suddenly as it began. The German squad lay still, rifles scattered across the earth. Hayes sank to one knee, catching his breath. His pistol was nearly empty again. He had 1 magazine left. The hill was secure, for now, but the battle was far from over. Below, an American lieutenant spotted Hayes on the ridge and shouted up at him, waving for him to come down. Hayes nodded but didn't move. Instead, he scanned the hilltop. Smoke drifted from further inland. More gunfire echoed among the cliffs. There were more positions, more threats. But the path was open. The men below were climbing, advancing, breaking through the choke point that had nearly cost them the entire assault. Hayes finally allowed himself a long exhale, unaware that what he had just done, alone, with a pistol, crawling through hell, would become one of the most unforgettable actions on Omaha Beach.
Hayes finally rose from behind the fallen tree, his legs stiff from the crawl and the constant tension. The hillside beneath his boots felt unsteady, a mix of loose soil and scattered debris from naval bombardment. He moved carefully, keeping his body low as he scanned the terrain ahead. The smoke drifting across the ridge made everything hazy, shapes blurring into silhouettes, but he could still make out the distant outlines of German strongpoints further inland, bunkers built into the hillside, trenches connecting firing positions, and narrow paths twisting upward toward the higher bluffs. Below him, more American troops reached the lower slopes. Their voices carried upward, orders shouted, men calling for medics, engineers preparing charges for wire obstacles. The chaos was slowly transforming into momentum. The 116th Infantry had suffered devastating losses on the beach, but now they were pushing forward with renewed determination. Hayes watched as the men surged upward, using craters and gullies for cover.
A corporal near the base of the hill spotted him and shouted, "Hey, soldier on the ridge! Hold position! Reinforcements coming up!" Hayes lifted a hand in acknowledgement, but he remained focused on the higher ground. He knew German defenses weren't built to collapse after 1 or 2 positions were lost.
These fortifications had been constructed over months, layered, reinforced, and manned by troops who understood the terrain intimately. Even with the 2 machine gun nests gone, the enemy wasn't defeated yet. A sudden burst of rifle fire echoed from above. Hayes dropped instinctively, taking cover behind a shallow rise. The bullets snapped past him, hitting the earth in sharp bursts. He looked up and saw a pair of German riflemen on a ledge farther up the bluff. They were firing down at the newly advancing Americans, trying to stop the climb before it gained momentum. Hayes tightened his grip on his pistol, knowing he didn't have the range to engage them from here. He needed to move closer.
48. He slipped along the ridge, staying as low as possible. The terrain forced him into a zigzag pattern, left, then right, then into a shallow dip carved by rainwater months earlier. He could hear German voices above him, shouting warnings, repositioning. The sound of boots scraping against stone carried through the smoke. Hayes felt the familiar tension return, the sharp focus, the controlled breathing, the weight of every small movement. He reached a narrow crevice that angled upward toward the ledge. It was steep, but it offered concealment. Hayes pressed himself against the rock face and climbed, using cracks and roots as handholds. His muscles burned from fatigue, but he pushed on. Every few steps he paused, listening to the rifle fire above. The Germans were focused downward, unaware of his approach. As he neared the top of the crevice, he heard 2 voices clearly, one giving directions, the other responding quickly. Hayes edged closer, peering over the ridge. The 2 riflemen were positioned behind a small outcrop of stone, firing down at the Americans climbing the slope. Their weapons rested on the rock, giving them stable aim. Hayes quietly steadied himself, checking his angle. This was close quarters again, exactly the kind of range where the pistol could make a difference. He emerged silently from the crevice, raising the pistol. The nearest rifleman turned slightly, catching a glimpse of movement. Hayes fired twice, clean, quick shots. The man fell back, and the second soldier spun toward him, reaching for his rifle. Hayes fired again before the man could aim. The echo of the shots bounced off the rock walls. Then silence.
19. He lowered the pistol and scanned the area. More fortifications lay beyond this ledge. Timber-reinforced trenches, dugouts, and firing positions. Hayes could see deeper into the German defensive system now. It wasn't a single line. It was a network. And the Americans coming up the slope would be exposed unless someone cleared these positions ahead of them. 38. He moved forward, cautiously stepping over the rocky ground. The terrain was rough. Broken stone, scattered splinters of wood from shattered fortifications, empty shell casings glinting in the sunlight. The air was thick with smoke and dust, making every breath heavy. Hayes paused as he reached the entrance to a shallow trench carved into the hillside. It connected multiple positions, each one capable of pouring fire down the slope if reinforced. He slipped into the trench, crouching low. The narrow passageway echoed faintly with distant gunfire. Footsteps approached, steady, disciplined. Hayes pressed himself against the earthen wall just as 2 German soldiers rounded the corner, speaking quietly. They weren't expecting anyone this deep inside the fortifications. Hayes acted first, stepping out and firing twice. The trench amplified the sound, leaving his ears ringing. The soldiers fell instantly. Hayes moved deeper, adrenaline cutting through his exhaustion. The trench system twisted left, then right, opening into another firing position overlooking the slope. An MG-34 sat on a mounted platform, unmanned for the moment. Boxes of ammunition lay stacked nearby. Hayes scanned the area. No immediate threats. But he knew leaving an intact machine gun behind him would be dangerous. He grabbed the ammo belts, scattering them into the trench, then kicked dirt into the breech to jam the weapon. It wouldn't fire again. 52. He continued moving forward, sweat dripping down his temples. The deeper he went, the more he realized how extensive the German defenses were. Multiple paths, multiple blind corners, each one potentially hiding another group of soldiers. He only had a handful of rounds left. He needed to conserve them.
10. As he approached another intersection in the trench, he heard voices, this time more urgent, more numerous. A squad. Hayes backed up, sliding behind a stack of sandbags positioned as a firing step. He held his breath. The German squad approached, their boots thudding against the wooden planks laid into the trench floor. Hayes counted at least 5 men, maybe 6, too many for direct engagement with a nearly empty pistol. He scanned the ground quickly, desperate for another weapon. Then he spotted it, a German MP-40 submachine gun lying near one of the fallen soldiers. Hayes grabbed it, feeling the weight of the weapon. He checked the magazine, half full. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself. The German squad appeared around the corner, rifles and MP-40s ready. Hayes stepped from behind the sandbags and opened fire. The MP-40 roared, the recoil jarring through his arms. The trench filled with the deafening echo of gunfire. The Germans shouted, scrambling for cover, but the narrow trench offered them nowhere to go. Hayes kept firing in controlled bursts until the weapon clicked empty. For a moment, the trench was quiet again. Hayes leaned against the wall, breathing heavily. His uniform was soaked with sweat and seawater, dirt smeared across his face and arms. His hands shook from exhaustion and the intensity of the firefight. But he was still standing, and the trench, this critical internal line of defense, was now silent. Outside, the sound of American voices grew louder. They were nearing the top of the slope, pushing forward with determination. Hayes climbed out of the trench, emerging onto the next ridge. He could see the highest part of the bluff now, a fortified bunker overlooking the entire sector. Smoke drifted from its firing ports. That bunker was the final obstacle, the strong point that commanded the whole approach. Hayes stared at it with tired eyes, knowing the hardest part was still ahead. But he moved anyway, step by step, determined to finish what he'd started, unaware that the next few minutes would define his legacy.
The German fire intensified, sweeping across the hedgerow like a burning blade. Bullets cracked through leaves, snapping branches above the pinned-down men of Company E. Andrews pressed himself deeper into the soil, the damp earth cold against his cheek as dirt showered over him with every near miss. The machine gun nest had zeroed in, and every attempt to shift positions was met with a merciless burst. For a moment, he closed his eyes, steadying his breathing, letting the distant thunder of naval guns rumble through his chest. He could feel the fear in the air, heavy, suffocating, as if the very ground trembled beneath the weight of the enemy's fire. He knew the platoon couldn't pull back. There was nowhere to retreat without exposing the entire flank. And with each passing second, the Germans were adjusting their fire closer, tighter, more precise. Andrews lifted his head just enough to see the shape of Lieutenant Carr about 20 yards away, trying to shout orders through the chaos. But his words were swallowed by the roar of gunfire. Men were trapped, helplessly pinned, waiting for an opening that wasn't coming. The realization struck Andrews like a blow. If someone didn't stop that machine gun crew soon, the entire assault line could collapse.
He wiped a streak of mud from his eyes and crawled to the nearest wounded rifleman, Private Lewis, whose leg had been hit when the first burst caught them in the open. Lewis tried to wave him off, insisting he was fine, but his pale face told another story. Andrews pressed a hand to his shoulder in reassurance before pulling himself back toward the forward hedgerow. He could hear the German gunners shouting over the weapons' clatter, adjusting their fire and preparing to sweep again.
Their confidence was unmistakable. They had found their advantage and were pressing it ruthlessly.
Andrews dug his fingers into the dirt, pushing himself forward inch by inch. This wasn't the dramatic, all-guns-blazing heroism people imagined war to be. This was cold, quiet, and terrifying. Every movement risked drawing fire. Every inch gained meant he was still alive. For now. The metallic click of empty magazines echoed behind him as his squadmates struggled to conserve what ammunition they had left. Rifles were nearly useless at that angle and distance. Hand grenades wouldn't reach, and the BAR man had already been forced back by the withering crossfire. By now, the German machine gun was firing in sustained bursts, the distinct rhythm of the MG-42 echoing across the French countryside at over 1,000 rounds per minute. Its barrel glowed faintly in the dim light filtering through the smoke. Andrews watched, studying the gunner's pattern. Short pause, reposition, long burst, shift left. Every few seconds, one of the assistant gunners leaned forward to feed another belt. They were well-trained, disciplined, and completely confident in their position. Little did they know that one American soldier was already crawling toward them, armed with nothing more than a pistol and an idea that bordered on madness.
He pressed himself against the earth once more as another burst ripped overhead, the force of it slicing the grass like a scythe. His helmet shook with the impact of debris falling onto it. Andrews knew he had one advantage. The Germans weren't expecting anyone to attempt a solo approach from the front. Not through open ground, not under that fire. But the hedgerows provided shadows, dips, and footprints left by centuries of farmers. If he stayed low enough and moved slowly enough, he could become nearly invisible. To his right, he heard Sergeant McAllister shouting for suppressing fire. A few rifles cracked in response, but the angles were bad and the round struck harmlessly against the machine gun's protective earthworks. Still, it was enough of a distraction to let Andrews crawl another yard forward. His arms trembled from exertion, and sweat stung his eyes, mixing with dirt and grit. The salty burn sharpened his senses. He could feel time slipping away. Every second the machine gun kept firing meant more wounded, more stalled movements behind him. At roughly 40 yards out, he paused, forcing his breathing to slow. He counted the seconds between the MG-42 bursts. 3 seconds. 2. 4. Randomized, but with just enough rhythm for a careful mind to track. Andrews waited for a longer pause, then pushed forward with both elbows, dragging himself across the cold grass. His pistol bumped lightly against his chest with each shift, its weight both comforting and terrifying. He had only a handful of rounds. There would be no second attempt, no reload under fire. Whatever happened next would happen fast.
The smell of cordite hung in the air, mixed with churned soil and the faint scent of crushed wildflowers the bombardment had flattened earlier that morning. The contrast felt almost surreal. Destruction and nature layered together in a moment that would define the lives of everyone pinned behind him. Andrews steeled himself. He could now make out individual figures in the German position. 3 men. One on the trigger, one feeding belts, another spotting and calling adjustments. Too many for a frontal charge, too far for a clean pistol shot, too exposed for a grenade. But Andrews wasn't planning on a charge. He crawled further, feeling the rough texture of broken branches scraping against his sleeves. 35 yards. 30. 28. The machine gunners were completely focused on suppressing the American platoon. None of them so much as glanced toward the ground directly in front of them. Andrews pressed on, clearing another patch of grass, his elbows bruised and raw.
Then he felt it, a shallow depression in the ground, just deep enough to shelter his approach for the next 5 or 6 yards. If he reached it, he could close the distance unseen, bringing him close enough for precision shots.
He lunged forward before the next burst, sliding directly into the dip as bullets tore into the ridge just behind him. Dirt exploded upward, raining down in gritty clumps. He didn't move, didn't breathe. He let the world go silent, except for the pounding of his heartbeat.